We're going to part 3 on 1959. It's been quite a year so far with Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside. What's happening around the industry is pretty incredible. We talked about how Curtis Fuller left Blue Note in '58, and he does some stuff with Savoy. He also does a great record here at United Artists. And United Artists is a film industry record label that launches. They decided to have a jazz department, and they do some pretty great stuff. This Curtis Fuller record, and Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, and Elvin Jones, is really an outstanding record. These United Artists records had fairly good distribution, but they're still pretty tough to come by. And this was accompanied by another great record on United Artists in '59, the great Motor City Scene, a Thad Jones record with the great Billy Mitchell, the great Al Gray, Tommy Flanagan, Paul Chambers, and Elvin Jones as well. So you see Flanagan, Chambers, and Jones back both of these sessions. And then Jones, Mitchell, and Gray, of course, are from the Count Basie group. Thad Jones is one of the great Detroit family members, the Jones brothers, of course. Al Gray is one of the great muted trombone players of all time. Both those United Artists records are pretty tough to come by, but are important parts of the jazz canon. In 1959, VJ really splashes on the scene. Walter Perkins, MJT plus 3, shows up. And Walter Perkins is a great drummer. He's also, if you've seen the Jazz Journal, I talk about him quite a lot. These guys are outstanding. Some of the best hard bop coming out of the Chicago labels belongs to the MJT plus 3. And then, number 3006, VJ Wayne Shorter introducing. Shorter is an Indiana native. He comes up to the Chicago area to record for VJ. Shortly after, he comes to the attention of Art Blakey, I think via Lee Morgan, who was on VJ at the time. And Wayne Shorter ends up becoming one of the most important players of the 1960s, first with the Jazz Messengers, and then of course with the great Miles Davis second quintet. But this is Shorter's debut on VJ, a tough record to come by. This is a reissue. The original is out there, but fairly difficult to get your hands on. Atlantic, quietly throughout this 50s, is doing a lot of landmark stuff. And while the label doesn't have the consistent body of work of a Prestige, a Blue Note, or a Riverside, what they're willing to tackle on the edges is broader than almost anybody. Nobody else would have touched Pithecanthropus in '56. And here we are in 1959, and a couple of the most important jazz records to ever come out here on Atlantic. Giant Steps, of course, with Coltrane's innovative Circle of Fifths, which is a numerical dissemination of the melodic structures of the music, yet he makes this incredibly complex numerical structuring accessible and listenable. It comes from hours and hours of practicing and rehearsing, breaking down scales and understanding the philosophies of the music, and somehow he reinterprets all that back into one of the most digestible, forward-thinking records of any era. And some people say this is partly what drove Sonny Rollins into one of his hiatuses. Every sax player still to this day wants to prove their chops by playing Giant Steps. And I don't think Giant Steps is even the whole story. Tracks like Countdown, tracks like Spiral, really the whole record. Cousin Mary, Naima, Saida's flute song, Mr. Paul Chambers. The whole record is outstanding. Flanagan's on the piano. I think Jimmy Cobb's playing drums, if I recall. My mind's getting a little frazzled in my old age here. Art Taylor's on the drums, sorry. And Paul Chambers, of course, is on the bass. One of the most important records in jazz history. And again, innovation is only as good as it is accessible. You could innovate a car that eats pizza, but why do you need a car that eats pizza? You can innovate all kinds of weird musical innovations, But if no one wants to hear them, you're kind of wasting your time. And Giant Steps is one of those rare instances where a guy was super innovative and dug deep into the structure of the skeletons of the music, and yet still made it to be melodic and accessible and enjoyable. It's an intense record. It's just over 30 minutes long. A lot of the tracks fly by at a lightning tempo. Some of these tracks remind me almost of a thrash metal group where they're just flailing at the powers that be. You know, it's a great piece and belongs in every jazz collection. And you can play that for your girlfriend. She might not love it, but you probably won't hate it either. And that's important. I honestly feel from my soul we got to stop playing jazz records for our friends that they hate. If you want to play shit that no one else is going to like, play it for your damn self. Quit driving people away from this music. It's important parts of American history. And why are you trying to play stuff people will enjoy? It's as simple as that. That's partly why I'm always kind of speaking about the avant-garde and free in a negative context, because I want people who are kind of new and learning and beginning and want to dive in to not take one taste and be like, yeah, fuck that, I'm done. That's not what we want. We want people to dive into this music and understand its context and place in American history. A1317 and A1327, they come 10 records apart, are Ornette Coleman's 2 Atlantic records. And Giant Steps is 1311, so it comes right before this one. So it's a string of 3 really impressive records by Atlantic in 1959. Shape of Jazz to Come, Change of the Century. We all know the impact that this group has on music. Don Cherry is on the trumpet. He often plays that little pocket trumpet as well, with Billy Higgins and Charlie Hayden rounding up the rhythm section. This quartet went out west, started playing on Central Avenue, created quite a buzz. They recorded on Contemporary. My buddy Jean-Michel said it was Shelly Manne who recommended to Lester Connick at Contemporary to record Ornette Coleman. So he comes out east and they start locking down the 5 spot, and people were just interested. Interest was piqued. There was lines waiting to see this guy, and the reviews were definitely mixed. Miles hated him. Some of the new players loved him. Coltrane was inspired by them. These 2 records, free jazz wasn't a term that existed at the time. He makes a record in 2 years called free jazz that ends up becoming a label for the genre. But he often states that free jazz is a mistake and a misnomer. The music they write is heavily composed. It's very much got a lot of signposts and markers that say we gotta all meet together there. It's not just free ramblings of 4 guys going, okay, go, and going 4 different directions. It is composed. And these 2 records are actually quite accessible. And they can get a little squawky and dissonant at times. Lonely Woman's beautiful. They're important landmark pieces, and they're also a nail in the coffin, because this was the great splintering of jazz, and jazz was already splintered. Jazz was already divided into camps. I did it. And this marked a real turning point. And in some ways, Pithecanthropus erectus in 56 is a precursor to all of this. You know, it really kind of sets the table for edge and dissonance in the avant-garde, but this propelled things in a new direction, and of course John Coltrane kind of jumps on board and he signs with Impulse, and Coltrane's now saying, okay, there's no more perimeter, there's no more fences, I'm gonna dive deep and see where I come up. And that leads us to what Columbia does in 1959. And that's Mingus Aum, Dave Brubeck, Time Out, and Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. And this is in George Russell's modal schematics. The band comes in and is playing these modal scales, finding melody and groove within simple modular structures of the music theory. It's a brilliant record. One of the most important records ever recorded. There's a camp out there that say it's overrated. It's not. It's brilliant because it's innovative and accessible, and it's omnipresent, and it really works in almost any environment, from weddings to parties to anniversaries to cocktails to lounges to late night romance. You can play Kind of Blue, and track after track will just fit and feel right at home. It's a super accessible, malleable piece of music that works anytime, anywhere. Omnipresent. And that makes it a landmark. And of course, Bill Evans is back in the fold with Miles. Wynton Kelly kind of gets sidelined for this one. I think he's on Blues and Green. Kelly gets one of the tracks. But Cannonball's on this. Coltrane's on this. It's just a giant of a masterpiece. Dave Brubeck, of course, started out west with the Weiss Brothers at Fantasy. He does some pretty cool recordings on the West Coast. He is a lot of what the cool is. Paul Desmond is one of the great alto sax players of all time. Defines the West Coast cool, the light, airy sounds. Here, they're on Columbia already for like 3 years before this comes out. And they're being quite successful doing their jazz at Storyville, playing the U.S. colleges, touring Europe. He's a very prolific guy that's making a lot of money in jazz. And Brubeck does this record where they tackle some interesting time changes. Blue Roundabout La Turk incorporates a 9/11 time signature, if I recall. It's like an interesting Turkish groove. Da 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 da. It's just kind of this driving, propelling, yet they make it work and feel accessible. Time Out, the great title track, is just Take 5. Is one of the great songs of all time. It's a Paul Desmond composition. I can honestly say that these two records were centerpieces of a lot of my DJ sets at the Red Cow. You know, you'd get this one almost every week, and you'd get a song from this one almost every week. And you'd also get that nod of recognition from people, like, oh, because they're very well known. And what Columbia does is gives distribution to the new sounds of jazz. It doesn't really have that until Columbia comes along. And that's important because now what was very regional and very local and known among the musicians and maybe the hardcore fans, suddenly the whole nation knew what was happening in jazz. Mingus Aum, Mingus is a real pariah. He can be very dissonant. He can be a thorn in your side. He can pull a pistol on you. He can be melodic. He can be sorrow-filled. He can be angry. He can be intense. And he can put all that in one song. If you listen to Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, that record goes from calm beaches under an umbrella to flailing over a cliff in a convertible. It's incredibly picturesque and has incredible elements of danger in it at times. This, of course, is a little bit more accessible. Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, Better Get Hit in Your Soul, Open Letter to Dude, Fables of Faubus. It's really a fun romp through what Mingus is about. It's fairly accessible for what Mingus is. And Mingus's reputation is kind of built on this record in a lot of ways. It's his one album that stands above the others in terms of luminosity, in terms of people's awareness of it. A lot of his stuff before this is on fairly small labels like Candid and Bethlehem. He does have some pretty important stuff on Atlantic, but his stuff on Atlantic was 55, 56, 57, when Atlantic's still very an unknown commodity. By 59, Atlantic, with the success of Ray Charles and a lot of the R&B and pop that they're doing in the 8000 series, Atlantic's ascending to becoming a giant. It's not Columbia big yet, but Atlantic's really getting there. But Columbia is a huge, important label. They do a lot to propel modern jazz into the whole nation's vocabulary, and this is, of course, a masterpiece of sorts. On the West Coast now, let's do Chicago first. Cannibal Adderley brings Miles Group to Chicago to record for Mercury this outstanding session. So it's the whole group from Kind of Blue minus Miles. And this is a great record. This is after Emercy no longer exists, 36-161. So it still gets a Emercy number, but it's firmly now in the new Mercury consolidation of their sequence. Not one of my favorite album covers. I think it's pretty awful, but it's a great record. And it's really great playing. Also in Chicago, Argo is really starting to come to the foreground. And this Jazz Tet record is the arrival of the Art Farmer Benny Golson Jazz Tet, one of the great Chicago hard bop institutions of 59, 60, 61. They make 5 records that are outstanding. Addison Farmer's in this group. Curtis Fuller's also in this group. So aside from his stuff on Savoy, aside from his stuff that we saw in United Artists, he's also doing stuff with this great group. And then Kenny Burrell makes this wonderful record live with the Vanguard. It's just a trio setting, but you hear the dexterity and beautiful improvisation of one of the great players of jazz history, Kenny Burrell. And Burrell is one of those guys that has the ability to mold himself into any setting. I'm a huge Kenny Burrell fan. I have a section that wide of his records. That leads us to the West Coast. Sonny Chris has this kind of comeback record on the Peacock label, a small label, and this is really a great record. Everything about this record is outstanding. Ola Hansen on the trombone is fantastic. Bob Cranshaw's on the bass. Walter Perkins is on the drums. It's Sonny Chris at his best. You can hear how melodic a player he is. He can play fiery bebop. He can also make your tear streak down your chin with one of his beautiful ballads. I'm a huge Sonny Chris guy. Contemporary, as I say, the West Coast sound is kind of disseminating. It's kind of no longer what we think of as West Coast. And the cool really kind of follows Brubeck. Time Out is the cool. Nothing cooler than Paul Desmond. But Harold Land, the Fox, this was initially issued on the Hi-Fi label, which I believe Contemporary consolidated into their roster. They reissued that record. I'd like to find the original with the original cover eventually. But this is a great Harold Land after he left, of course, the Max Roach, Clifford Brown group. And he's been on the West Coast doing some great stuff for Contemporary. This is a great piece. This is Art Pepper plus 11, so it's a bigger group, and they're doing the music of a lot of great modern players like Gillespie, Joffrey, Monk, Mulligan, Parker, Rollins, Horace Silver. It's a bit of a bigger, more complex piece than what you expect from West Coast, but they're doing some of the great composers of the modern idiom. So when you're going to play Joffrey, you need some great players behind you, and the players here include Art Pepper, Pete Condoli, Jack Sheldon, Dick Nash, Bob Envelson, Vince DeRosa, Bill Perkins, Herb Geller. It's Russ Freeman, Joe Mondragon, Mel Lewis. It's a who's who of the West Coast White Cats doing all the great Black Cats music. It's a great record. Interesting hearing these guys, who are all incredible players, play these versions of those great songs. Also in 1959 on Contemporary is one of my favorite West Coast groups ever, and that's the Shelly Manne Blackhawk group with the great Joe Gordon on the trumpet, with the great Richie Kamuka on the saxophone. Shelly Manne, of course, is driving the proceedings around his kit. These 4 records are jazz royalty. I think anybody would enjoy these 4 records. They're playing a lot of standards, playing these long, beautiful versions. Listen to Summertime from Volume 1, I believe it is. And if you ain't sucked into these records by that, I can't help you. Outstanding stuff. And then on Pacific Records, Teddy Edwards shows up after being off the scene for a while. He mixed this record with Les McCann, Leroy Vinegar, and Ron Jefferson. Outstanding stuff. It's nice to hear Teddy Edwards back in his fiery ways, doing what he's doing. And Pacific now has changed over to the P series, is number P6. So the 1200 series is no more. And really, when Pacific gets to this new sequence, by 59, there's a pretty big change in how Pacific sounds. And you're starting to get a lot more of Les McCann, who of course is on this record with him. And Les McCann's a great piano player, a great singer, kind of a gospel shout singer. Les McCann's a great, interesting player. And you get stuff like, who's that organ player I'm trying to think of? Not Curtis Amy, he's there as well. Paul Bryant is the organ player. I'm trying to think of Groove Holmes is also on Pacific at this time. So Curtis Amy, Paul Bryant, Groove Holmes, Les McCann, that starts to represent what Pacific Records is about at this point. It's no longer the Mulligans and the Bud Shanks and the Chet Bakers. Those guys have all moved on to different things. And now kind of this West Coast soul jazz is happening. The Jazz Crusaders are also on Pacific at this point. And that stuff's all kind of, I wouldn't call it easy listening, but it's soul jazz. But it's not even as fiery as what Prestige is doing. It's more cool soul jazz. West Coast cool soul. I just made that up. You like that? So that wraps up 1959. The changes are everywhere. VJ shows up. United Artists shows up. Bethlehem's pretty much no more. I'm not even featuring anything by them at this point. Anything they are putting out is under the King label. So there's just changes everywhere in the music. And 1960's on the doorstep. And 60 kind of kicks in the door of composition. There's less and less blues-driven music once we get into 60, 61, 62, and more complex arrangement, complex composition, stuff that requires more rehearsal. It's fantastic stuff, but it gets away from some of the guttural crying of what the earlier cats were telling us. And the music loses its audience in this time. And the interesting thing is the audience for jazz today seems to really only know jazz from 1959 forward. Most people come to jazz through Kind of Blue. They might dive in, with some Coltrane, First Miles Quintet. But for the most part, the modern jazz fan knows 59 forward. And not enough people go back. And there's far more of the iceberg underneath 59 than there is tipping above. And what's left from 59 above the surface is this small little peak of 59 through into the 70s. That's this little bit of the body of the music. And underneath that water is 4 decades of shaping and creating this music. And the strands and striations that create jazz in the 60s have little audience. And Columbia keeps it churning along, somewhat commercially successful, and he sells great quantities of some of his titles. Coltrane, of course, keeps Impulse going, and Impulse is doing a lot of other interesting things. And of course, Impulse is going to show up in 1960. That's another big change that's going to happen. In 1960-61, Verve changes their direction completely. So we'll document all that as we go forward. But so we've seen quite a bit of changes here from 53 to 59. It's been quite the ride. Savoy's descending. Bethlehem's kind of hardly even on the radar at this point. Riverside has really risen. We almost seen the crest of Blue Note in a way in 57, 58 in terms of the body of the work, the power of its innovation, the deliverance of the hard bop. It's that moment, and that's already being diminished. Atlantic's ascending, but really it's the rhythm and blues at Atlantic that's giving its power to that label. The West Coast sound is kind of almost gone, even though the West Coast labels kind of reinvent themselves and really assimilate East Coast, West Coast, black, white, kind of all starts to mingle together a lot more in the 60s, and that's a good thing. VJ comes on the scene in 59, in the 60. They do some great records in 1960 that we'll see in the next year. Argo starts to really establish what their sound's going to be. Emercy is no more by 59. No more. Gone. So it's interesting watching the rise and fall of these record labels and where they fit in the jazz canon and where they were very integral parts of the jazz canon and where they become periphery. It's all quite interesting stuff to me. I hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. Prestige, of course, has the 2 branches of New Jazz and the 7000 series. Blue Note's going to make some more compositionally driven stuff. It's going to slip a little bit in terms of sales and popularity. In 1960, Jimmy Smith gets hired away, go to Verve Records, and it takes Boogaloo to kind of bring Blue Note back into the black, being financially tangible again. So again, this was a tough business. Very few people were making it rich playing this music. And a lot more white cats made it rich playing this music than black cats. A lot of those white cats ended up in the film studios and television orchestras and the big bands. A lot of these black cats just did it for a living because they loved it, because they had to. It was what they needed to survive. And by, of course, the end of the 60s, jazz, in all of its original permutations, is no more. What we hear from jazz in the 70s, by the Keith Jarretts and the Grover Washingtons and the fusions, jazz isn't jazz anymore. It's grafted into other things to try to survive. It's taking elements of rock and R&B to try to create itself a marketplace. It's popular in Europe, and that's a lot of where the well-selling records are coming from. Is ECM stuff coming over from Germany and Denmark and France. So a lot of changes are happening. But 59 in the American record label industry was a crazy year. I enjoyed sharing it with you and talking about it. I look forward to talking about 1960 coming up sometime next week. Y'all be safe. Peace.